Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Walter Edwards.
Walter, you muted yourself.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Walter Edwards. I'm the director of the Humanities Center, and I have a very limited role today. I'm so pleased that all my role is to sort of roll the credits ahead of this movie. I generally you wait until the end of an activity to say thanks, but I think it's a good thing to say thanks up front. So I want to thank this enormous audience for attending this second effort of the Humanities Center to hold a book launch program. You're on target to have the Humanities Center's largest audience this year. You're almost getting there, so I thank you for coming. I also want to thank the author, Stephen Chrisomalis, for submitting his book to be reviewed for this program. And I'm deeply grateful to the event coordinator, the event chair, Professor Elizabeth Lublin from the History Department. She is a member of the Center's advisory board, and she's the person who at one of our meetings in the fall suggested that this would be a good way, this book launch program that she is familiar with, would be a good way for the Humanities Center both to promote humanities in the university and around the world, and also to show off our outstanding faculty. The advisory board soon agreed, and she took the helm in organizing the advertisement and designing the way in which we would proceed. And so the center is deeply grateful for her involvement. You'll see the results of her organizing abilities in the way this program is structured today. I thank Professor Houston for gracing our university's presence with his outstanding work. He is an extraordinarily well-known scholar, and we're grateful to have you on our campus. I also want to thank my staff, specifically Kennedy Cockrell, who is the Humanities Center's Brumbaugh coordinator, but she has taken charge of the advertising of this effort and designing the flyer and working with Professor Lublin to make sure everything is in order. And she's here today in the background, letting people in. And of course, if you misbehave, she will be the person to kick you out. And she has a steel-toed boot ready to do so. So, and she is ably supported by the other members of my support staff, Tani Dev, Farjana Raham, Rene Mohammed, and Kiera Pulliam, and by our outstanding administrative assistant, Tiffin Carter, who is here today as well. So thank you all for coming. And now I turn everything over to the event chair, Professor Elizabeth Lublin, who will take charge of everything from here on out. So, Professor Lublin.
Thank you very much, Walter. I appreciate it. Just to throw out our shout out of thanks myself to Walter and certainly Kennedy and others at the Humanities Center for supporting the idea of the book launch. And thank you as well to Professor Chrisomalis for agreeing to share his work, Reckonings, Numerals, Cognition and History. I also wanted just to acknowledge his very extensive work in helping to shape the program and do the advertising, reaching out to all of you, as well as thank MIT Press for the ways in which it used its social media to spread the word. Another thank you to Professor Stephen Houston for joining us from Rhode Island to share some comments. But before I turn things over to Professor Houston, I would just like to go through the order of the program for the day, so you all have a sense of how we will proceed. We will start with Professor Houston introducing the work, sharing some thoughts on reckonings, and then Professor Chrisomalis will read some portions from the text itself, maybe up to about 20 minutes. That is based on, a presumption that maybe many of you have not yet had an opportunity to read the work in full. And this will provide a basis for you to get to know a little bit more about what he argues in this work, and maybe piggyback off some of that reading for your questions. As a third component, we will turn then to a question and answer. That question and answer will be moderated by Professor Houston, and we request that you put all of your questions within the chat, just to help facilitate swift movement and whatnot. So without any further ado, let me turn things over to Professor Houston.
Thank you so much. And I take it my audio is working A-OK, Kennedy? Very good. It's my very distinct pleasure and honor to present Steve's book today and to moderate the discussion. I think it's very, very seldom in the field, as I know some of our guests here will understand since they've been involved in these projects, that there's one person who is quite simply the best in the world at what they do. And in Steve's case, it's the study of the graphic representation of numbers, and beyond that to what this implies by way of understanding quantification throughout the human adventure and also into the deep past as we access it through those graphs. And Steve is, of course, as you know, in an anthropology department, and so he is also situating all of these practices within social and cultural practice, and indeed within history. And so it's always done, and this is something that I admire and truly envy in Steve, with the greatest level of at times, stunning erudition. It takes him across the world, and we're going to be flying around the world with him today. We're not necessarily encumbered anymore by COVID isolation, and Steve is going to take us to far and wondrous places indeed. The other thing I would say is that, as I mentioned before, I've been involved, as well as a number of colleagues who are present today, in comparative projects in which we look at writing systems and their development over time. We hesitate to use that word evolution, which is fraught with so many negative connotations. But it's without question the case that whenever we think of this domain of human expression, it's always get Steve. We hope we can twist Steve's arm to be involved, because he's so singularly accomplished at this kind of comparative project. You probably know as well that Stephen is from a different country, not too far away from Detroit in this case. He's a Canadian, and we won't hold that against him. He has his BA from McMaster in 1996. He's a relatively young person, at least from my gray-haired vantage. He also has a PhD from McGill University, and that's a salient fact this afternoon, because he studied with the late and truly great Bruce Trigger, who was a graduate of my university. He's one of the first students of my professor, Michael Coe. And in the best possible ways, Steve Chrisomalis is a continuation of Bruce's explorations of the comparative aspects of human development across time and space. And Bruce's books are well known and well entrenched to a laudable extent in anthropology and in anthropological archaeology. And Steve is taking us there as well. I think it's also fair to note, and this is probably true for some of my books, that they are eminently forgettable. That is, they're ephemeral, they won't last long in terms of their import or their impact. But I would say categorically and decisively, this book is absolutely not one of them. It's lucid but lighthearted. It's profound but also highly accessible. And I would urge all of you, please, to go out and purchase this book as soon as you can. And it is well presented and beautifully edited by MIT Press, which deserves a lot of kudos in this case for producing this work. it also expresses something that we can touch on today, which are the impulses that take us into the exploration of multiple domains of knowledge, and how difficult that is to pull off today in the increased specialization that is the characteristic of the academy today. Now, what Steve has been looking at, as I noted before, is how graphs having to do with quantification, with numbers, are represented around the world. But if you think about it, they rely ultimately, or refer ultimately, to an even more important question, which has to do with how counting and calculating are fundamental to society. And Steve does this always in an historical vantage from an historical perspective, and he takes us into that realm of very specific human motivation that fascinates us all, I think, as we understand and explore these matters. So ultimately, this book, and this is what I hope will prompt some collective deliberations today, is about human comparisons. It's acknowledging that we are all members of the same species, that we are all equally endowed with similar attributes and possibilities and affordances, as Steve would put it. And this is one of, I think, one of the notable, you might say, moral contributions of anthropology, which is to continually insist on this predicate of human existence, that we, all of us, are capable of similarly great things. And Steve is someone who, in this book, is also examining a highly important question in all of anthropology, and that is to do with how are novelties accepted? That is, how are changes in our society, the way we think about the world, the way we express it, how are these matters eventually accepted or at times rejected? And this is a fundamental discussion that is, I would say, very much the center of Steve's thinking about Roman numerals, which have vexed many of us from an early age. And he has, I think, a very well-informed discussion of how we are to conceive of this aspect of what humans accept and what they don't, what follows fashion, what does not follow fashion. And then lurking behind all of this, naturally, is the matter of human cognition, which takes us back to the universalism that is so central to Steve's project, building on that of Bruce Trigger. And that is, what is it that is resident in the human mind that all of us share, that takes us into similar ways of thinking about the world, and indeed of expressing it graphically, and ways that might be quite distinct. And so all of these have led me to a continued close study of this book, which I've had in my midst, my paws for a number of months. And I am, again, always having my breath taken away by his ambition, and the fact that this is an aspect of anthropology that is increasingly left behind in our focus on the particular and the focus on the historically contingent only. And in fact, it's a kind of tussle. It's an elaborate choreography we have to explore analytically between these things that are of this time only, and then those that in fact issue from the human mind and the brain and the wiring synaptically that all of us have within our own existence. And so, having made these brief marks, and I hope sufficiently extolled our presenter today, and with justification, I would like to turn it over to Steve himself, who might read some passages from this book. And then, as we promised before, I will be moderating discussion that will appear in my chat box, and then we'll be able to continue from there.
Whew. I don't know what to say about all of that. That is such a wonderful introduction. I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully that is a successful endeavor, and then I'm going to begin with my remarks and then some reading. So yeah, hopefully everyone is able to see that okay, and still see me in some capacity. So there we go. All right, so first I want to extend my enormous thanks to Walter Edwards, Betsy Lublin, and the Humanities Center for sponsoring this event. You know, all of us are engaged in this constant adaptation to the changing circumstances of our world, and I really appreciate the Humanities Center being as forward-thinking as to put together an event like this. I want to thank my colleagues in the Anthropology Department and the Linguistics Program at Wayne State University. We have a really fantastic intellectual community here, and it's been my privilege to be part of it for the past 13 years and ongoing. And it is my honor to present some of this work to you today. I want to thank my editor, Phil Laughlin, and the folks at MIT Press, and I see that Phil is here, and I want to really say what a wonderful experience it's been working with MIT Press. And if any of you have manuscripts, I know a guy. It's really a joy to be able to talk about my work today to folks from the press. I want to thank students past and present who have come out today. I'm always grateful to see your smiling faces, or at least to see your black smiling Zoom boxes that I will presume are smiling in absentia. Friends from all over the world, senior scholars in fields as diverse as cognitive science and Egyptology and classics and history and anthropology and linguistics, who have all come here today. And last but certainly not least, thank you so much to my dear friend and colleague Steve Houston for your warm, generous, overly generous, extremely thoughtful remarks on my book, Reckonings, Numerals, Cognition, and History. And I think that I'm really looking forward to having an exciting discussion. Please, anyone feel free to use the chat function at the bottom of the Zoom chat to put any questions, and we'll be having a moderated discussion afterwards. I'm really looking forward to that discussion. But for now, I'd like to start by reading a lightly revised version of 2 sections of Chapter 7 of Reckonings, Numerals, Cognition, and History. And to begin with a question: is your number system weird? On the surface, this question may seem weird, and you may be thinking that its author is weird too. But I mean it seriously. We have these numerals 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and we know how to combine them using place value. We, in the Western world, begin our thinking lives as infants surrounded by numerals. If you grew up in any Western country, you were surely exposed, almost from infancy, to brightly colored letters and numbers to look at and chew on and think about. And one result of this exposure is that, largely unconsciously, you came to accept that your numerals are normal and natural. This exposure is also the root of human ethnocentrism, that feeling we all experience where things to which we've been exposed habitually are easy to take for granted, while unfamiliar experiences can produce reactions ranging from mystified wonder to disgust. It's not good, but that sort of ethnocentrism is almost certainly inevitable. So, my first reaction to the question of whether the Western numerals are weird might be that every number system is weird viewed from the outside. This is a form of particularism, the notion that ideas and practices are unique configurations existing at particular points in time and space. Particularism is widespread in the social sciences and humanities, and for good reason. There are lots of things that are local and unique, but are nonetheless highly worthy of our attention. There is a lot of emphasis in popular and everyday discourse about science on generalizability in a way that suggests that we ought always to be looking for the most generalizable facts about the world, and by that logic, only universals ought to be of interest. But generalizability is always about generalization to some set of cases or examples. We do not presume, for instance, that biologists who study tapeworms ought to be able to generalize their findings to earthworms or manatees or orchids. There's nothing wrong with studying the particulars of something. But you might rightly object, sometimes we really do want to compare like with like, apples with apples, tapeworms with tapeworms, numbers with numbers. Some of the things in which we might be interested in identifying are rarities in numerical systems. Things that only happen very rarely, but that nonetheless do happen. For instance, a vast majority of the world's languages have a numerical base of 10, with 20 also being very popular. A sample of 196 languages in the World Atlas of Language Structures reveals that 125 languages are decimal, those are blue, 20 vigesimal or base 20, 22 a mixed decimal vigesimal, 20 restricted or having few enough number words to need no base, 4 having a system using body parts as numerals, and 5 having some other base. Decimal systems are found on every inhabited continent across dozens of language families. This cannot simply be a coincidence. We would rightly conclude that while normal is definitely too loaded a word, common certainly applies to decimal or base 10 number word systems. In contrast, within this sample, only one living language, Ikari, also known as Kapauku, spoken in New Guinea, has a base 60 or sexagesimal system. Now, we're fairly used to thinking sexagesimally because our time system has base 60 elements, but we certainly don't have any special number notations or symbols for 60 or for its powers. In fact, the only other language to have a sexagesimal structure that I'm familiar with is Sumerian, last spoken millennia ago in Mesopotamia. Do we conclude, as some have done, that Ikari numerals were borrowed from Sumerian? Barring any historical or other linguistic evidence, of which there is none, the only way we could do that is to show that base 60 numeration is so weird that it could only have happened once. But how would we know that? If it happened once, why could it not have happened twice? Because our knowledge of pre-modern languages is so limited, because written records are extraordinarily partial and skewed towards elites, and because historical linguistics depends on modern languages to reconstruct past ones, we actually have no idea how many times sexagesimal numeration was invented, simply on the evidence. We need some body of theory to help us explain why some notations are common and others are rare, before we could possibly answer the question of what is weird and what is not. We actually know very little about what kind of sample the world's present 7,000 or so number word systems is, out of all the linguistic variability that has ever existed in the domain of number. Most of that is permanently lost to us, and even the parts that we can reconstruct using historical linguistics depend on the survival of elements of past languages in their modern descendants. We are on firmer ground, though still not completely secure, with regard to the world's numerical notations. They're visual and relatively permanent, and we can be somewhat sure that there weren't any base structured notations, the 5 basic types that I've outlined in Reckonings and elsewhere, prior to the advent of literacy around 5,500 years ago. But if the Cherokee numerals that I describe in Chapter 5 of Reckonings can fall so close to slipping out of our knowledge, though they were invented less than 200 years ago, they survive only in one manuscript. There's every reason to think that there are many more numerical notations for which evidence does not survive or has yet to be found. Thus, the answer to whether a number system is weird or not depends partly on the accumulated empirical evidence of number systems past and present, but also on some set of theoretical principles about what sorts of processes we imagine led to their development. 10 years ago, I would have sworn up and down that induction was the best approach in the historical disciplines, that we could never aspire to absolute truth, but when in doubt, we should stick with what we can know directly. But a purely inductive approach only handles well the sort of data that already exists. I don't think all is lost, but we need reasons to hypothesize that our comparisons are good ones. There are good theoretical reasons to suppose that some things are pan-human, and that some numerical structures, like decimal notation, were cross-culturally just as common today as in the past. And while it's difficult to reason about things for which there's no direct evidence, if all actual known numerical notations fit into 5 basic common structural types, even if we can imagine numerical notation with other structures, and even if there were some really weird numerical notations that never survived, one reason for it may be that the others weren't, quote, good to think with, that they violated some general principle or norm that human brains prefer. But this brings us to a second issue. What is the future of numeral systems? There's a strange paradox in the progressivist framework under which much of Western thinking about technology operates. On the one hand, for many of us, there's a perception that time is speeding up, that social change is happening more rapidly now than ever before, and perhaps even that the rate of acceleration is itself accelerating. Partly this is surely a cognitive bias, derived from a combination of a certain good old days brand of traditionalist narrative in the media, techno-utopian futurist notions of progress, and the fact that at the scale of the life course, one's formative years seem to pass more slowly than one's later life. This logic leads to some varieties of transhumanism, a viewpoint that contends that in the near to medium future, technology's interface with the human body, and specifically the human brain, will accelerate beyond the point where we can reasonably be considered human, and ultimately, through superhuman intelligence, will lead to a technological singularity, the scope of which we present humans can hardly fathom. Under this frame of reference, we have absolutely no reason to expect that the enumeration systems of today will be anything but laughable to humans perhaps only a century in the future. Futurists may not be thinking specifically about the numerals of the future, but as numerals are the product of modern human cognition, we can readily see that the numerals of today may not be suitable for the post-human tomorrow. On the other hand, there is an almost perverse certainty in many domains of existence, including number systems, that the people of today have come up with the one true answer to many central problems, and that essentially no further progress can ever be made in them. Much mockery was made of the political scientist Francis Fukuyama when he published The End of History and the Last Man in 1992, signaling his belief, which by the way he now largely rejects, that with the fall of communism, liberal democratic capitalism was the final social configuration of human societies. The notion that the next millennium, or 5 or 10 of human existence, will have a single mode of production and a single form of political decision-making, as absurd as it is nonetheless still widespread. But partly this is a failure of our imagination, although for the record, many such alternative models are available across political spectrums and philosophical frameworks, if you just care to look. The idea that we're at the end of history of numeration is similarly widespread. As the cognitive neuroscientist Stanislas Dehaene remarks, if the evolution of written numeration converges, it is mainly because place value coding is the best available notation. So many of its characteristics can be praised: its compactness, the few symbols it requires, the ease with which it can be learned, the speed with which it can be read or written, the simplicity of the calculation algorithms it supports. All justify its universal adoption. Indeed, it is hard to see what new invention could ever improve on it. Whew. All right, you might respond, what might such a new killer number system look like that might replace the Indo-Arabic or Western numerals? Now, I might respond, I'm not a futurologist, and I would simply note that it's unlikely that 10,000 years from now, our descendants will still be using the same 10 digits with place value. While there are notations, like the Egyptian hieroglyphs or the Roman numerals, that survive for a millennium or 2 or even 3, even these undergo change over their period of active use. So why would we expect that change to have stopped? Now, my job is not to make up new systems, just to describe them. But I can see that this response, although accurate, is not the best possible one, because several numerical notations explicitly designed to be better than Western numerals, for some value of better, for some purpose, are already on offer. First, there are systems developed by groups like the Dozenal Society of America. Founded in 1938, it was originally called the Duodecimal Society of America for some decades, before it was decided that this was too decimal-centric of a name, so they changed it. The society advocates for base 12 arithmetic in place of base 10, principally because 12 is a highly composite number with many factors, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and 12, making work with multiplication and division more convenient. For numerals, converting to base 12 would simply be a matter of adding single digits for 10 and 11, and you can see those here. But that's a fairly minor change in the big scheme of things. For most of us, if we ever think of alternative number systems, choosing a different base is a pretty obvious variant. So dozens, or at the very least tens, of science fiction writers have created weird number systems for alien or future human societies, and most of them just use a different base along with ciphered positional notation like our own numbers. Similarly, we may be familiar with hexadecimal numbers used in computing, whereby the letters A through F represent 10 through 15, so that 1A equals 1 times 16 plus 10. As an accommodation between the binary nature of electronics and the constraints on conciseness that make actual binary numbers too long for the human eye and human mind. But let's get weirder. In 1905, the mathematician and title scientist Roland A. Harris published a now nearly forgotten article entitled Numerals for Simplifying Addition in the American Mathematical Monthly. Harris began by noting that many of the number systems of antiquity are self-evident in meaning, while the digits 0 through 9 are obscure in their meaning and simply have to be memorized. The systems he's interested in are what I call cumulative additive, using repeated signs that are added together, while Indo-Arabic or Western numerals are ciphered positional. Harris proposes then to reform our digits, keeping the decimal place value system intact, but reshaping the digits themselves, as in the second column here, using the model of combination of vertical strokes for 1, horizontal strokes for 2, and circles for 5. Because these signs are additive, the structure of each individual sign combines 5s, 2s, and 1s as needed. They can be read just as a Roman VIII can be read as a 5 followed by 3 1s. By adopting these new signs, he argued, arithmetical errors will be reduced, numerals will be learned more quickly and with less effort, and children will learn addition more rapidly. A modern cognitive scientist could argue that they offload more of the reader's and writer's cognitive load to external representations, and thus require less cognitive work. A semiotician might note that these signs, although not exactly iconic, are more highly motivated than our present opaque ones. They preserve all the advantages of Western numerals and add to them a new additive clarity in the sign forms. But of course, their adoption never happened. In fact, Harris's work does not seem to have been cited by anyone except me in the century or more since its publication. We can look at this system and see that it is, in some sense, superior to Western numerals. And at the same time, we can see that it would have been very difficult indeed for this early 20th century innovation to be adopted and to replace Western numerals. As clever and innovative as it is, Harris's system is a solution to a problem that no one was facing. But perhaps you want a system that actually has a demonstrable current use. There is a gap between the imaginable and the attested. In other words, those things that the human mind is capable of imagining are numerous, but many of those things never find their way into use because of cognitive and functional constraints. Only a small set of stable engineering solutions satisfying multiple design constraints survive and thrive because they're solutions to human problems and because they're perceived as sufficiently relevant to warrant their adoption. There is such an alternative numeral system, and you've likely seen it before if you've ever looked inside electronics. Almost every electronic device uses resistors to create resistance measured in ohms, and they almost all have a set of colored bands to indicate their resistance, standardized internationally. The first 2 or 3 bands represent some numerical quantity, using different colors to indicate the numerals 0 through 9. So here the leftmost band is blue, representing 6. The next is gray for 8. The third band is the multiplier band. It uses the same color system, but it represents powers of 10. So in this case, brown is 1, or 10 to the 1, which is 10. So the product of the first 2 bands and the multiplier gives the resistance, 680 ohms. And then the fourth band serves a different color scheme, which represents tolerance, but it also serves a useful function of highlighting the end of the numeral to quickly show the reader to start at the other side. These color bands are highly distinct and visually salient at small scale. Resistors are generally only a few millimeters thick. The colors are useful for human eyes, at least for those of us who have normal color vision, in the context of a non-linear text medium. Resistors can be oriented in all sorts of ways within a circuit board. Where bright color is visible at small scale, it can be readily processed. Cross-culturally, though, numerical notations almost never use color directly to represent differences in numerical value. It's probable that color serves some semantic function in the encoding of the Inca Quipu records, but not apparently to indicate differences in numerical value. But in most written traditions, whether incised in wood or stone, imprinted in clay, or written with ink on some flat surface, using color to denote a semantic difference is rarely necessary. Structurally, resistor numerals are similar to somebody saying, I make 56K a year, with 56 being the digits and K being the multiplier for 1000. They combine a positional structure for the significant digits, and then they're multiplicative for the power. They're most useful then for representing round numbers, ones with one or more trailing zeros, in a very concise way. And thus they're similar to scientific notation, which is principally used to express large or small round numbers, but is fairly useless for numbers without a lot of zeros. To write 478,239 on a resistor would require 6 bars of different colors, 4, 7, 8, 2, 3, 9, followed by the multiplier bar for times 1. But nobody makes a 478,239 ohm resistor. That kind of precision isn't needed. You might, however, have a 470,000 ohm resistor, in which case you just need the 4 and the 7 along with the multiplier for 10,000. Thus, resistors rarely need 2 or at most 3 digit bands plus a multiplier band to indicate the resistance, even for really high resistances up to the millions of ohms. In writing, conciseness in numeration, at least conciseness to this degree, is rarely an issue. But on a tiny resistor, being able to convey the resistance in just a couple of visually salient colored bands is very valuable indeed. Now, I don't suppose that everyone in a century or two is going to use resistor numerals generally. Nonetheless, you have in your home numerous instances, possibly hundreds, of a radically different numeration system from the Western numerals. One that was invented in the mid-20th century and is still used decades later in electronic devices throughout the world, albeit hidden from ready view. People, real humans who design, install, and repair electronics, find them more useful than Western numerals for this purpose. We don't need to be transhuman to use them. They were designed by humans to be read by humans. In conclusion, not only are there imaginable alternatives to Western numerals, but some of them are actually adopted and in use. We should bear in mind that many new innovations will fall and will fail to be adopted under the pressure of frequency-dependent biases, as in the case of the Cherokee numerals. Even so, the fact that invention in the domain of number continues apace, and perhaps has even increased in pace, demonstrates the continued vitality of human numerical inventiveness. We should thus feel liberated to ask, under what conditions and in what contexts a seemingly ubiquitous killer system like the Western numerals can have its triumph upended. Knowing how it came to be universal is one step. These conditions are, as I've shown in the case of the Roman numerals, likely to be a combination of cognitive structural and social ones, linked through ongoing processes of reckoning, evaluating, thinking, judging, deciding. The next step is to ask how this system, our system, came to be believed to be irrevocably triumphant. We can hardly foresee the details, but we should check our arrogant assumptions that the narrative has ended forever. We are not at the end of the history of numbers, and we never will be. Thank you.
Steve, you're probably seeing little graphs for applause, and hopefully you can even hear some of them through those who are unmuted. For those of you who came in a bit late, I am Steve Houston. I am the moderator of the discussion this afternoon around this very welcome book by Professor Steve Chrisomalis about the matter of reckonings, about how graphs are to be conceived having to do with enumeration and numeracy around the world. I would also say that Steve has, in the readings he gave us today, given us a very impassioned advocacy of what he has described as, along with others, macro anthropology. That is, viewing anthropology in terms of big questions about big matters. And the other thing I hasten to add is that it isn't really about a reductive utilitarianism. It isn't this idea that these ideas simply float free of human contingency and history, but that it is possible for us eventually to use this new knowledge to enlighten, to lead to better ways of conceptualizing basic human practice. Now, this is a book also that is concerned with the acceptance of novelty, but also with efficiencies, as he has described. And in that spirit, along with Kennedy and Walter, we've decided that it would be most efficient for you simply to send or tender your questions in by means of the chat function, and then I will moderate and read them aloud, and Steve can answer in turn. I will, as tends to be presumptuously the case with a moderator, ask the first question. It's apparently the privilege of that moderator, and it will also get things moving somewhat. And I've known Steve for some time, and seeing that he's on a fascinating intellectual journey, and of the sort that we all wish to have in our own careers. And he also is posing lots of fascinating questions in this book, and hopefully in the discussions, about the realms of different disciplines, about where we are to live, where we are to think, which approaches are we to adopt. And I wanted to ask you first, Steve, a basic question. This volume, Reckonings, is somewhat slimmer than your erudite and quite encyclopedic book done some years ago for Cambridge University Press on graphic notations. It clearly builds on it. I wanted to ask you first, as the first part of my question, how has it built on that book, but also where are you going in your future pathways? Where are you going to tread next? And then the second part of my question had to do with the fact that we are notably hosting this within a humanities center at Steve's University. And so we are, all of us, concerned crucially with, as I said before, with the human adventure, but also sometimes in troubled relationships with the STEM disciplines that seem to be taking over our universities, for better or worse. And so I wanted to ask you, why would this book be relevant to the humanities more generally? So the first question is, whither Steve? and then the second question would have to do with, how does this fit within this complex set of disciplinary realms?
Thanks. That's a fantastic question, or two questions, and really the answers are interlinked. Let me take the second half first, and say that, in many ways, and I think anyone who's known any of my work for any period of time knows that these divisions between the humanities and STEM disciplines are artificial, and they're temporary, and they're historically situated. And I don't want to get into a big CP Snow two cultures sort of debate today. That's not my goal. But simply to show that in fact, showing the way that the humanities are relevant to, that they're not merely an add-on to scientific modes of reasoning, but in fact that they have a lot to say. And one of the things that I think particularly that the traditions I come out of, which is sort of comparative anthropology and comparative linguistics, the sort of things that 100 years ago used to be called, and still are sometimes called, philology. But that's not quite what I mean, although that is part of the book and it's part of the discussion. Part of what that discussion is about is showing how the kinds of reasoning and the kinds of comparative insight that come out of the humanities do in fact have direct benefit to disciplines such as cognitive science. And anthropology was one of the 6 founding disciplines of cognitive science once upon a time, along with other humanistic disciplines like philosophy and like linguistics. And that's become attenuated over time, and I think much to the loss of cognitive science, that the cognitive science without that humanistic impulse is in fact a weaker science. And so coming from that tradition where I'm a comparative and cognitive anthropologist and linguist, part of my goal is to show how some of these insights actually help us to ask better questions. And that's not just for our own sake, although it is for the sake of my narrow range of colleagues who work on number systems, but to actually ask really big questions about numerical cognition, the kinds of questions that are not merely askable and answerable in a lab, that they're not merely askable and answerable in a formal experimental context. That's not the kind of work I do, not because that's bad work, but because the kind of work I'm aiming to do is enriching the question asking of other scholars who I hope will pick up this book, will read it. Apparently, I think it only costs $35, and maybe there'll be a link that appears in the chat if anyone wants to make a purchase. That we're building out a systematic set of knowledges and that are not merely oppositional to the sciences, but are in fact integrative to the sciences. And my professor and my dear late mentor, Bruce Trigger, referred to anthropology as the integrative core of the human sciences. And I think that's quite right. But I would extend that even further, and I would say that it's the integrative core of the sciences. One of the things that it brings to bear, and this really comes to the second part of your question, is its comparative framework. And I think one of the things that when we think about comparison in anthropology, that we often think of a particular kind of thing, a particular kind of work. So for instance, work that's done in the human relations area files, which is often disparagingly called tribe trait comparisons. Among the Kwakiutl, they have, this kinship system or something like that, and then they'll do that sort of comparison. And I think that work is actually much more important than is recognized, but it's also not the kind of work that I do. Because I actually think that anthropological comparison is much broader. So when we talk about what anthropology brings, sometimes people will say, well, anthropology is holistic. I don't particularly like that. I think that's a muddy word that doesn't solve the problems that I'm grappling with. I think it's integrative. I think it's building links between different sorts of disciplines, and I think it's comparative. So those are the things that, to me, are fundamental. So I think you're right, Stephen, thinking that this is probably the last big book I write on number systems, although, like as you point out, it is quite a bit smaller than the 488 pages of numerical notation in comparative history. I think we came in at 256, which I'm happy about. But this is probably the last numbers book I write, or at least the last one I write for a while. But I think what we really need to understand is to understand anthropology, and in particular my own subfields of linguistic and cognitive anthropology, as they contribute comparative and integrative approaches to a broader scientific enterprise, which is for me principally cognitive science. And I think there are other disciplines like cognitive semiotics, of which I would also consider myself a fellow traveler, that are engaged in this same enterprise. And so for me, that's the next step, is probably to add to ask, now that I've done this, what can we say more broadly about some theories of human behavior, and what kinds of comparisons can anthropology bring to the table that maybe haven't been fully recognized as good comparisons as we go forward.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve. We're getting a number of questions spilling in, and I hope there are more to come. They seem roughly to divide into large questions that muse and ponder the state of anthropology within the sciences. And then there are a series of more mathematically oriented questions, not so much about their graphic expression, but about mathematical systems. However, before doing that, I do want to point out that there is indeed a link for this book that's provided by Philip Laughlin, which is over in the chat. If you wish to purchase this book, as we urge all of you to do, please, there it is available for you. Let's start with a question about anthropology. To some extent, you've probably touched on this already, Steve, but you may know, as some people point out here in the chat section, that in the NSF system by which we solicit grants from the federal government, anthropology is seen as a STEM and then a discipline. And this is obviously a very hot debate going on in our subject. Could you or would you wish to perhaps respond to the placement of anthropology today and perhaps in the near future with respect to STEM or with respect to other disciplines that are of antithetical mind?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of you may know, and I see some of my colleagues from the Society here, that I'm the president-elect for the Society for Anthropological Sciences, which is one of 40 sections of the American Anthropological Association. So I have some skin in the game. And I think one of the challenges is when we say that anthropology is a science, what exactly is it that we're saying? Are we simply saying that anthropology is a STEM discipline so that we can get a grant or so that our budget doesn't get cut? And if that's the answer, that's definitely the wrong approach. You know, if we're simply using this as a rhetorical device, saying, well, what we do is science, of course, then I think we're making a very, very serious error, because I don't think we'll be taken seriously by anyone. And I think it would also deny the enormous amount of humanistic work that is done in anthropology that is not antithetical to the scientific work that I and others do. And so you know, in some ways, these are debates about terminology. And I understand, of course, that they have an impact. And part of our goal is then to ask, well, what do I mean when I say that anthropology is a science? What does it mean to say, so for instance, that I tend to see anthropology as a field science, and in that it actually has, and it's also a historical science. That's a framework adopted by David Aberle in an article he wrote in American Anthropologist many, many years ago now, in the 80s, where, you know, anthropology has in common with paleontology and geology and historical cosmology, but also historical linguistics and classical philology, that it has in common that these are historical sciences, that they're historical disciplines that are unified not by their ability to create law-like generalizations about the world, because those are few and far between when it comes to historical sciences, but that they're able to generalize explanations, for the phenomena that they see. And so to return, one of the things that I really emphasize in reckonings is not that we should compare one society to another or even one system to another. All we can do, we can compare one number system to another, but to actually compare processes, to compare events of change. So in other words, to treat as the unit of analysis the abandonment of a number system. And there's a very good book that I read once or twice by some colleagues that I see in the room here called The Disappearance of Writing Systems. Professor Houston is one of the co-editors of that volume. It's very nice. And that similarly adopts the same approach of asking, what happens when a writing system disappears or ceases to be used? And similarly, you could ask those same sorts of questions, but those are different sorts of questions. But nonetheless, I would insist that they're scientific questions. And then we can get into some, you know, very, I think, tiresome debates about, you know, boundary maintenance and gatekeeping between the sciences and humanities. Those questions don't interest me at all.
Thank you, Steve. And I think many of us share this view of that thematic questions are the way forward. And I think you've made an eloquent case for that. I did mention before that there are two more specifically mathematically oriented questions. One of which comes from Victor de Munck, who asks you, Steve, can there be mathematical systems that don't have anything to do with mathematics as we know it today? That is, as a means to measure and quantify.
So can there be? That sounds like thank you, Victor, for your question. So I think one of the arguments I raise in Reckonings is that actually most of the time numerical systems are not mathematical, and that evaluating their functions too narrowly in terms of their utility for mathematical functions is a mistake. It's certainly not the case that I want to ignore calculation entirely, but arithmetic is not the reason for number systems to be developed. The number systems develop for representational functions. In other words, to communicate. And when you're communicating, then you have to ask, what are you trying to communicate and for what audience? So I think that we ought to, that word for in your question is actually doing a lot of work. If you say, are there number systems that are not for arithmetic? If you mean that they weren't designed for arithmetic, I would say, well, then all of them aren't designed for arithmetic or for mathematics. If you're saying that they could never be used for arithmetic or mathematics, I actually don't think so, because I think that they all could, because actually mathematics is basically a system of logical relations between objects, and almost anything can be understood mathematically in that sense, whether it's a number or otherwise. But I think that really highlights for me the importance of divorcing why these representations exist from their ultimate use, because ultimately I understand why mathematicians and why historians of mathematics have focused on the computational functions of number systems, but I actually want to step back from that and ask, what are they actually used for? And as it turns out, most of them are not used for computation at all.
Thank you very much, Steve. The second question in this category of query of you, Steve, comes from Amalia Ganandasikan, if I've pronounced it correctly. If not, my apologies. I will abbreviate her question a little bit and just ask you the first and last part of it. You mentioned that base 60 numeration is very rare, but I can think of a number of cases in which some small nod is made to a special status of 60. And then the final part of that question is it common to have this sort of hints of bases that are not the main base in a language culture number system?
Yeah, thanks, Amalia, and thank you for coming. And I would say, yes, it's quite common. And so some of these, right, are well known. You might be thinking in terms of English, things like 11 and 12, but 11 and 12 are actually very decimal in their origin in Germanic languages, and in Anglo-Saxon they're basically unlif and twalif, one left and two left. So once you get to 10, you have one left and you have two left. But there are, of course, two well-known non-decimal structures in English, and in fact lots of other languages related, and those are the dozen and the score. And I was actually very pleased to be able to present, I think now 3 years ago, it doesn't seem that long, but I think it was, Walter, to present here at the Humanities Center the work that I and my student Alison Delaney did on dozen and score, and the development of dozen and score as sort of adjuncts to the English number word system, that have their own history, their own system of adoption, and then their integration within English numerical morphosyntax. So that's not a subject I spend a lot of time on, but those folks in the Dozenal Society, they're not doing something unique. That those sorts of traces can come in and out of number systems quite regularly. They actually come in and out of verbal or lexical number systems much more fluidly than they do numerical notations. Numerical notations are much more rigidly structured, so that sorts of unusual numerical elements are less likely to be incorporated into number symbols than they are number words. And that's probably because language is a much more fluid and actively changing phenomenon. There are a lot of reasons for that, which go beyond the scope of this discussion.
Thank you, Steve. And we are moving ahead to a number of other questions which have flowed in the meantime. And one comes from your colleague there, Tamara Bray, who doubtless because of her background in South America and with the Inca system, asks about tactility and numeracy and wants to know how this has entered into your discussions or into your thoughts.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tammy, for your question. I could go on for several hours. I won't, because I'll try to keep it to 2 minutes. But I mean, one of the really important things to understand in the case of the Roman numerals is that the Roman numerals were not ever a computational system. That the Romans, like the Greeks, had what the archaeologist and historian of science Reviel Netz calls a counterculture. In other words, that numeracy in the Greco-Roman world was largely construed through pebbles on a board. You know, this is what we imagine an abacus as a rod with some beads on it, but in the Greco-Roman world, it's a board with grooves on which pebbles are strewn, or rather not strewn, that they're lined up in a place value fashion. And so when we talk about why the Roman numerals were replaced, very often the answer that's given is, well, that's because they were no good for math. But the truth of the matter is the Romans, and in fact medieval Europeans, weren't really using Roman numerals for math. Not in the way we imagine. They weren't lining up Roman numerals in columns or this sort of thing, because there was a much more embodied perspective, and it was both an embodied cognition, but it was also an extended cognition, that it was extended through these material objects. So when the comparison was being made, and when the Indo-Arabic or Western numerals were being introduced into Western Europe, and I'm starting as early as the 10th century, but really getting going in the 14th and 15th centuries, the comparison was always, are these new numerals better than the abacus? Not, are they better than the Roman numerals? In fact, nobody ever disparaged the Roman numerals until they were long gone, until they were archaic. And it wasn't until the 17th and 18th centuries that people started to say, wow, it's a good thing we got rid of those Roman numerals. They were very useless. But the truth of the matter is that they weren't useless. They just weren't useful for the functions that people imagined them to have been. And so, yeah, I mean, I really do think that most of the cases of the way that most of the computation that we do actually takes place in a much more tactile, extended, and embodied way. One of the things that's really fascinating, I do some ethnographic work with my dear colleagues at the Wayne State University Math Corps. And one of the things that's always been fascinating to me is to see, when you ask people arithmetical problems, to see them do work with their fingers. Now, I don't mean literally that they're counting with their fingers. If I ask you what 6 times 7 is, you might go like this for a while. But actually what's really fascinating is to see, when you ask that question, to see people doing a little bit of work on their fingers that is almost it almost seems vestigial, that the fingers are activated. And of course, there's a lot going on with both the hand and the eyes. But and that can include, writing a problem out in paper like this, but it also includes this sort of very physical, embodied cognitive process, which doesn't actually result in a representation, and it's not literally computing with the hands, but it is as if there is a memory of, or a knowledge of, the role of the hands in facilitating or affording arithmetical practice.
Thank you very much, Steve. And if I may interject my own question, the cover of your book shows, of course, a clock. It's basically looks like a sort of watch that your grandfather would have placed into one's pocket. But what I wanted to comment on or ask you about is this idea of concretizing quantification. That is, it's not just an ethereal system of numbering, but it's often specifically applied to certain things. This is especially true with some of the Mayan languages that I've studied. But Steve, what is the relation between quantification and time, and beyond that, the control of time? I think here of early states, I think of 9 to 5 labor that is very much under discussion in this country, or 5 days a week and so forth. But what is the interaction, you might say, between the quantification of something like time itself and the systems that you have studied?
All right, so first of all, a word about this image. So this is because I think it's worth, and I'm going to actually just share the screen just for a second so that people can see it once again if they've forgotten. So everyone should be able to see it now. So this is a pocket watch designed by the French horloger Jean-Antoine Lépine. Lépine had a long and very productive career in 18th century France. Somehow managed to survive the revolution despite having, as I understand it, various monarchist leanings. But Lépine was one of the first horloger or clock and watchmakers to introduce Western or Indo-Arabic numerals into watchmaking. Prior to that, Roman numerals were pretty standard. You're looking at these things and thinking, well, those aren't any numbers I know of. You can look at them and you can figure them out, but it takes some work. But they actually have a very systematic logic to them. That for Lépine, what was really valuable about this weird hybrid system wasn't just that it was a weird hybrid, although I guarantee you're looking at this now and it's meant to be striking. It's meant to attract the attention. But what was also important for Lépine was that he wanted it to be symmetrical and balanced, that he did not want long numbers like VII and VIII sticking way down there at the bottom. And one of the advantages of converting those into V2 and V3 is that each number on these Lépine watches takes no more than 2 digits, no more than 2 characters. And so this was a way of aesthetically balancing the clock face. Now, this wasn't your question. The question you asked was about the relationship about time and power, and particularly state power. And of course, you're absolutely right that's a subject that many other authors have studied, and that I have not spent a lot of time on. But I want to note that actually a lot of the work we do in clock arithmetic is actually not directly related to numerical representations at all. So for instance, let me give you all a little arithmetic problem. You're all here, you didn't think you were going to have to do arithmetic, you were wrong. Just ask yourself, how long is it from 10:30 to 11:10? And, if you're like me, that only takes you a couple of seconds, and you pretty quickly come up with the answer 40 minutes. Great. Good. Now, how did you get that? And when you ask people this question, and I've asked many people this question, what's fascinating, first of all, is the real prevalence of co-speech gesture. That people will say, well, I just started at 10:30 and I went up to 11 o'clock and then I went another 10 minutes to 11:10. So actually here there's another example of extended cognition using the clock face, that the clock face becomes an analog tool for manipulating time mentally in the same way that in East Asia, abacus users do arithmetical calculation not with written representations, but with the abacus. And so what's important is, what you never hear anybody say is, well, I started at the 6 and then I went up to the 12 and then I remembered that 6 times 6, each of those units is 5 minutes, and I multiplied 6 times 5 and I got 30. And then I went from 12 to 2, and the 12 I have to remember is like a 0, and then I had to go another 2 past that, and that's another 2 times 5, and that's 40. You could have, but you didn't. And so the reality is that most of you did that calculation without numerical representations being centrally relevant. So there is a connection, but then also I want to push back a little bit against the notion that that is necessarily a lockstep connection between arithmetic and numerical representations and temporal or chronological representations. The answer is actually much more complex than that. But again, there are people who study, for instance, the history of capitalism and the history of the time clock and the history of that, the sort of the regulation of time in capitalist states, as well as, of course, the kinds of reckonings with time that you see in sort of Babylonian mathematical astronomy, or of course in the Maya case. And those cases are sort of beyond the scope of my talk today. But yeah, there's a connection. But what is it and how does it work? It's trickier than you think.
What better way to respond than to say it's trickier than one thinks? That's how all of us, I think, wish to respond frequently to the problems that beset us analytically. One question comes to us from Donna Sutcliffe, and it seems to be more of a counterclaim or comment, Steve, but I'll read it off to you and then you may respond. Dehaene regarded place value as being the last law, which is placed in quotation marks here, so to speak, of mathematical notation. To challenge this idea, you pointed out, Steve, that the numeration system used on resistors makes no use of place value. However, this system relies on our traditional numeration system, which uses place value for its interpretation. That humans, even young infants, cognize numerical magnitude as an extent through space suggests Dehaene is correct.
So I'm certainly very happy to acknowledge that place value is a very important principle, and that in fact I don't know whether it's the last law, and neither does Dehaene, because how would we know? How would we know whether, if you were a 4th century Greek, you would think that your ciphered additive, non-positional notation that was used by all of the Greek mathematicians was the best that could ever be because nothing else had ever come along. So I think in one hand, we actually don't know. But on the other hand, there's this kind of slippage in Dehane where he says, well, place value is the best, therefore our present system of numerical notation is the best and nothing else could ever replace it. And that slippage is unwarranted. That I think that place value is useful, but place value is only useful for certain purposes. And place value is readily abandoned by all speakers and users of English whenever you need to write a big number. For instance, if you ever have had to deal with a style guide, and thankfully my lovely publisher and folks at MIT Press were wonderful, but every style guide has some rule about, well, when do you abandon place value? So if you have to write 46 trillion in your book, then you don't write. And you, in fact, are not going to be permitted to write 46, comma, 0, 0, 0, comma, 0, 0, 0, comma, 0, 0, 0, comma, 0, 0, 0. In fact, they'll say, no, you're just going to go 46 and then you're going to write trillion. You're going to do it multiplicatively. And that's for reasons of conciseness. And that's for some very pragmatic, understandable reasons relating to your audience, that your audience doesn't want to read that number. They don't want to look at it. They don't want to, they're disgusted by it. I'm disgusted by it. And so to say that place value is universally justified is simply not warranted on the very basic facts of the way we actually use numerical representations. Place value has its value, pun intended. And then it's really important to step back and ask, under what conditions do we choose to not use place value? Under what conditions do we choose to do something else? Oh, resistor numerals use place value right up to the point they don't, and then they have this extra multiplicative element to indicate a power. That's really useful if you want to represent round numbers, so you don't have to have a whole bunch of trailing zeros, which you could never write on a resistor. And so that's where exactly the point where Dehane is wrong. It's exactly at the point where he asserts that nothing else could ever be better than it that forces me to ask, better for what? Better for what purpose? And that's where I think that he's actually entirely wrong.
A vigorous exchange of viewpoints, which is what we want to hear this afternoon. Steve, there is a question of methodological sort, which comes to you from one of the attenders. And this individual asks, whether you have found it useful to employ the EHRAF, the HRAF World Cultures data in your work.
So yes, to a degree, and certainly not as much in this particular book, but I think it's useful. It has some value, not in the coding of for statistical analysis, but in a way to get a hold on a large body of ethnographic literature that is sort of coded paragraph by paragraph, and certainly been plugging along in eHRAF and looking at code number 801, which is the code for enumeration, is a thing that I've done. Of course, the challenge is now that there's so much that's not in those databases that can actually readily be obtained through other means. I mean, the vast increase in our ability to search for scholarly material from 100 years ago is so much greater than it was, that I think that the value of HRAF for doing that kind of broad search for different kinds of number systems isn't as great as it used to be. Where it does have value is, of course, where one is doing questions of sampling and one is trying to raise those sorts of statistical analyses. But that's not the sort of work that I'm presently doing. I do think it's worth doing, and I think Bill DeValle has a really neat paper from some years ago where I think he does some neat things with work on number systems. But that's where I stand on that.
Thank you very much, Steve. We have another question which comes to us from Margaret Winters, which is the following. Apropos of weird number systems, and I believe she's employing weird in the sense that you are.
She is.
Are there other cases analogous to the at least English-speaking way of giving directions using clock face references? that is to say, on your 6 or a 12 o'clock high?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I guess one question would be how widespread is that among clock users, among and how in how many languages is it found? In that case, I would think they would all probably have a single origin in a Euro-American tradition of clock reckoning. The one thing that I'm really struck by, and that is a neat comparison, which is also from a Western tradition, is that Charles Frake wrote a paper in 1985 or so on the medieval mariner's compass and the use of the mariner's compass not just as a means of calculating direction, but also as a means of reckoning time. And it was a really fascinating little short paper that actually embodies many of those general principles that I was talking about earlier. And I think it's an important paper too, because it is, for me, the kind of paper that is both historically situated, but that is also a cognitive anthropological account of a particular way of using a device that in this case was oriented towards direction telling, also as a means of reckoning time. The argument is more complex than I could present here, but those are the sorts of interesting things. It would be really interesting to see other kinds of ways that numerical reference gets kind of repurposed, and I think that's an interesting one. I don't know of any offhand, but I wouldn't rule it out, and I'll probably think of one 15 minutes after the talk, in which case I'll give you an email, Maggie, and let you know.
We have come to the end of our list of questions, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of my colleagues there at Wayne State, and particularly our host, Walter, and Elizabeth, and also Kennedy, in thanking all of you for coming. I don't know if Walter or perhaps Elizabeth might wish to make some final remarks, but I'm grateful for this opportunity to welcome this welcome book into the world, so to speak. We're here at a birthing rite of a formal sort, and there are few more worthy books than this, I think, in the comparative study of graphic systems over the last couple of years, and it's been my great pleasure to attend. So I guess I'll kick it over to Walter or to Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. One of the things that I most appreciate about the Humanities Center and its various programmings is the opportunity to get out of my own small niche of modern Japan. And I have a whole new appreciation of Japan's adoption of a different numeral system in the late 19th century in the context of Western imperialism, thanks to this discussion today. Very much a macro level in a sense, but again, the different ways in which these kinds of conversations can prompt thought to those in disparate fields is very much one of the advantages of being involved with the Humanities Center. We are coming at the end of the Humanities Center programming for the year. I want to thank all of you, but particularly Stephen Chrisomalis and Stephen Houston for leading us in such a dynamic and engaging conversation today, presentation. Thank you so much. This is definitely a high note on which to pull the academic year to an end. And thank you all otherwise for joining and for your questions. Whether you joined from near the Metro Detroit area or from afar, again, we appreciate your participation. And if you have any follow-up questions for our author, I certainly encourage you to be in touch. And then certainly if you are interested in purchasing a copy of Reckonings, there are various opportunities to do that. The link through MIT Press with more information about the book was in the flyer. And then I believe Steve's editor, Phil, posted a link to Amazon within the chat. I will leave it at that. Again, thank you all very much, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for being there. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Steve.
All right, that concludes our program. Dr. Edwards, can you stay on just a little bit longer?
Okay.
just you, so we can chat. But thank you so much. Have a good one, everyone. Mm.